The night is gentle now. The day has passed, and the world outside has grown quiet. The hum of busy hours has softened into silence, and all that is left is a time for rest. Here, in this stillness, you have come to a safe and peaceful place. Welcome, dear listener, to Whispers of Faith. A place where stories from long ago rise softly once more. Not as loud battles or sharp commands, but as calm rivers of memory. Words flowing in gentle streams to help your mind settle, your heart find peace, and your spirit draw near to God. Take this moment to breathe. Slowly, deeply. Let the rhythm of your breath become steady, as though each breath were carrying away the weight of the day. Inhale hope and exhale worry. Inhale peace and exhale fear. For this night is not about striving or rushing. It is about rest. It is about being still. You are not alone in this night. As countless generations before you have closed their eyes with Scripture echoing in their hearts. They too rested in the faith that God is near, that His hand holds them even in the darkness. And tonight, you share in that same timeless assurance. Our story this evening is one of courage and faith. One of a young shepherd boy, unknown to the world, yet known deeply by God. It is the story of David and Goliath. Not told with loud voices or shouts of war, but told in whispers, as if the earth itself remembers, and as if the stars above still look down on that valley where courage and faith met fear and pride. Before we step into the story, let your body sink into comfort. Feel the bed beneath you, supporting every part of you. Let the tension in your shoulders ease. Let your hands rest calmly. Let your thoughts quieten like a still lake at evening. Each word that follows will flow gently, carrying you like a small boat drifting on calm waters. This is not just a story of battle. It is a story of peace found in trust. It is a reminder that faith can calm storms, silence fear, and carry us through the valleys of life. And as you listen tonight, allow yourself to feel that same stillness settling in your own soul. The hills of Israel will rise gently before you. Valleys will open like quiet arms. A shepherd boy will sing his songs to God beneath the endless sky. And a giant's voice will thunder across the field. But the story will move slowly, with the hush of evening upon it. Each moment unfolding not to quicken your heart, but to slow it. Not to fill you with worry, but to fill you with peace. Tonight, the story will become like a lullaby of courage. Courage that is not born from strength of arm or height of stature, but from the quiet assurance that God is faithful, and that His strength is made perfect in weakness. So, let go now. Let go of the noise of the day. Let go of every burden that tried to cling to you. Let go of tomorrow's questions and yesterday's memories. They are not needed in this moment. This moment is for stillness, for calm, for rest in the presence of a God who watches lovingly over you. As the story begins, Imagine the warm breeze of the Judean hills, the scent of grass after the sheep have grazed, the glow of the sun lowering beyond the horizon. Feel the world of Scripture drawing close. Not distant, not unreachable, but here, near enough to carry you into sleep with a quiet heart. Rest in these words. For the night is long and gentle. The tale of David and Goliath will be told as if the stars themselves are speaking. And as you follow along, may your own giants seem smaller. May your own fears grow quieter. And may peace guide you slowly into dreams. And so, with heart at rest, we begin. Evening folded itself over the hills like a soft cloak, and the land of Israel breathed in quiet patterns that had been kept for centuries. The ridges rose in calm lines, gentle as the backs of resting sheep, and the valleys opened like welcoming hands. Stone terraces stepped down the slopes, patient work of many seasons. Each ledge holding soil, roots, and olive trunks that had learned the language of wind and light. Vines clung where the sun lingered longest. Figs hid sweetness beneath broad hands of leaves. And barley fields, after harvest, lay like pale quilts sewn by steady hands. All of it moved by the same slow rhythm. The hush between day and night. The long exhale of a land that understood waiting. Along a wide valley that would later be remembered, a brook ran in a winding silver thread, speaking in murmurs to the stones it touched. It had worn them smooth with faithfulness, turning roughness into gentleness over many years. Each stone rounded by persistence rather than force. Birds drew close to its edges at dusk, dipping beaks like tiny cups into the coolness, leaving quiet ripples that wandered outward before fading. Crickets lifted their evening song. Not loud, only steady, as though they were stitching the edges of night to the hem of the earth. Over the far slope, a shepherd's low whistle drifted, answered by the soft shuffle of hooves, and the hush of wool brushing grass. The land held stories long before voices told them. Stories layered like thin veils. Morning upon morning. Harvest upon harvest. Paths braided through the hills where sandals had pressed the dust into memory. And where dew, each dawn, remade the world with a clean, glimmering skin. In small villages, doors breathed out the day's warmth when they opened, and clay lamps kindled modest halos over simple tables. Mothers folded breadcloths and set them near cooling loaves. Fathers checked ropes and tools by habit, and children leaned against door frames, watching the sky trade its bright garment for a deep blue shawl. The world did not hurry here. It flowed, and the flowing taught even the worried to loosen their grip. There were watchtowers, too. Humble stone columns on high points. Guardians for vineyards and flocks. They rose without hurry from ground that welcomed them. Their rough stones warmed by daylight and soothed by night air. From such perches, a person could see the valley widen like a river of earth, could trace the line of the brook by the glint of star-caught water, could feel, without words, that the land was a cradle and a threshold at once. Beyond the hills, the sea slept. The desert waited. And the cities held their own heartbeats. But here the countryside listened. And the listening deepened the quiet. At dawn, the land woke softly. Never with clamor. Always with a careful hand. Mist lay in the hollows like a prayer that hadn't yet risen. And the first light touched olive leaves so they flickered silver. Then green. Then silver again as the breeze turned their faces. A rooster called from a courtyard, answered by another across the barley stubble. And the thin, bright notes of a shepherd's flute stitched a narrow ribbon of joy through the cool air. Smoke began to speak the language of breakfast from low roofs. And wells received the morning visit. Ropes creaking. Buckets wet and shining. A gate bar scraped wood. A hinge complained briefly, then settled back into usefulness. And footsteps headed toward fields that had learned every name that walked them. Midday arrived like a slow bell ringing. Not loud. Only steady. Heat rested its palm on stones and walls. And lizards wrote cursive on sunlit rocks with quick tails. The brook grew quieter then, its surface turning into a sheet of glass with drifting dots of light. And bees kept their errands among thyme and wildflowers that tolerated the warm hours without fuss. Shadows collected beneath fig and tamarisk, precise shapes grown generous by the moving sun. And workers took bread in those pockets of shade. Olives, cheeses, and dates laid out with gratitude more than ceremony. Words came sparsely in such hours, because the land suggested silence. And silence answered every question with calm. When evening returned, it smoothed everything it touched. Sharp edges. Hot thoughts. The day's little worries. Lamps were lifted like captured stars and set where families gathered. Where small stories were told in gentle threads that reached back to fathers' fathers and mothers' mothers. In one courtyard a lyre hummed a steady ground beneath a simple melody. In another the soft scrape of hand on millstone drew flour from grain with patient circles. And in another, laughter came like small bells shaken once or twice, then left to settle. A visitor could wander those lanes and feel held by the rhythm, by the courtesy of people accustomed to limits, by the sky growing deep enough to carry every burden without bending. The land knew shepherds most of all. Their way of moving a flock like water around stones. Their instinct for weather. Their quiet courage when night lay heavy and creatures prowled in shadows. Each shepherd learned the hills as a friend learns another's face. The places where the wind told lies. The gullies that kept a secret spring even when months went thirsty. The thorn patches that promised safety if approached rightly. the ledges that echoed one's own voice back with counsel to keep lower or climb higher. Staff and sling were not ornaments here. They were maps drawn in wood and cord, instruments for guiding and guarding, shaped by hands that practiced kindness as discipline. In the wide valley, grass bent in a shared direction when the evening wind traveled, each blade agreeing with the others, not in weakness, but in the understanding that the same wind moved through them all. A fox sometimes stitched its quick path from one side to the other, leaving a temporary seam that the night would unthread. Owls wrote soft circles in the air and erased them at once. And the stars began their slow procession like lanterns carried by patient angels. Far beyond sight, armies had their noise and their pride. But here the earth honored small things. Seeds, droplets, rounded stones that had learned to let go of corners. Farmers knew the language of seasons, not as masters but as students who never graduated. They read the sky as if it were a scroll. The taste of dust before the first rain. The smell of petrichor when it arrived. The thin white threads of clouds that promised little and gave exactly that. They paced their hope within those lessons. And hope, when kept at a humble pace, did not break. Children watched those adults and learned by imitation how to tie a rope that would loosen without tangling, how to stack wood so that flame would find it quickly and burn slowly, how to share water with the same grace as bread. In all of this, the land taught patience, and patience taught peace. On the edges of the valley ran the traveler's road, simple as a line on a palm, full of stories that didn't need to be told out loud to be true. Traders led donkeys with packs that sighed, spices whispering from their knots, copper glinting in narrow places between cloth folds. Strangers greeted one another without haste, palms open, eyes not guarded. Hospitality was not a decoration but a door kept on its hinges. And a stranger's thirst was an obligation met with joy. The land, generous but not extravagant, fostered such ways. Because the people learned generosity from hills that never ran away and from springs that gave without boasting. Night deepened. A soft ink poured slowly from the horizon's cup, and constellations steadied themselves above the valley. From the brook came the smallest voice, the hush of water over an especially smooth stone, a whisper of movement that sang of miles traveled and miles to go. Somewhere a ewe answered her lamb with a comforting murmur, and the flock settled into a clustered confidence that made the darkness gentler. In that quiet, a thought could stretch to its full length without tearing. A prayer could rise without stumbling. And a heart could remember that strength does not always shout. Sometimes it breathes. Sometimes it waits. There would be a morning soon when the valley's quiet would carry the weight of two armies watching each other across the wide floor of earth. There would be a voice that set the air trembling, a tall shadow that made courage hide in tents, and a small figure who looked like a question turned into a person. But the land did not hurry to that hour. It held the space in between with dignity, continuing to offer dew to the grass, coolness to stones, and a home to every sound that belonged to evening. The brook still smoothed its stones, not knowing which would be chosen, but preparing them all with the same patience. So the land of Israel rested beneath its starry roof, ancient yet freshly made with every dawn, humble yet strong in the way true things are strong. Hills waited without anxiety, valleys opened without fear, and the path toward tomorrow remained a simple thread anyone could follow with steady steps. In this place, wonder did not flash and vanish. It endured, because the ordinary was tended with care. And care is the soil where wonder grows without noise. And into such a land, into such a rhythm, into such patience and peace, the next chapter of a timeless story would quietly take its first breath. Beneath the wide sky of Israel, where the stars moved slowly like patient guardians, there lived a boy named David. He was the youngest of many brothers, his hands smaller than theirs, his shoulders lighter, his voice still carrying the timbre of youth. Yet what he lacked in size, he carried in spirit. For while others busied themselves with the weight of duty and the press of battle, David learned the rhythm of care, the art of watching over sheep, and the beauty of stillness beneath heaven's endless canopy. His days began early, when the mist still lay low in the valleys like a blanket not yet folded away. With staff in hand, he would guide the flock from the folds of his father's house toward open fields. The bleating of lambs mingled with the calls of birds waking with the dawn, and David's own voice rose to meet them in song. For his heart was not only a shepherd's heart, but also a psalmist's heart. Each note carried a prayer, not spoken in ritual but poured out freely like water onto dry ground. He sang of God's goodness when the sun rose, painting the sky with colors so soft they seemed woven by angels. He sang of God's mercy when clouds drifted across the horizon, shading the earth like the hand of a protector. He sang of God's faithfulness when the stars reappeared and the sheep gathered close for the night, their warmth pressing against each other, their trust resting in the boy who watched with quiet resolve. Life as a shepherd was not without danger. Wild beasts prowled the edges of the hills, lions in search of prey, bears restless in hunger. Yet David's courage grew not from pride or boasting, but from the knowledge that the God who made the hills also guarded those who walked among them. With his sling and staff, David learned to defend his flock. He practiced with stones until his aim was true. The sling whistled through the air like a bird in flight, and the stones struck with precision born of patience. Each practice was more than preparation. It was devotion, a way of shaping his hands into instruments of protection. his heart into an altar of faith. But when the fields were calm, when the sheep grazed in peace and the dangers of night kept their distance, David's mind wandered to songs that had no audience save the sky and the God who listened always. He strummed the strings of his lyre, each chord trembling softly through the evening air. His music mingled with the sounds of creation, the brook whispering over stones, the wind humming low through olive branches, the quiet breath of sheep drifting into sleep. Sometimes he would gaze toward the horizon, where distant hills folded into each other like the pages of an ancient book. He wondered at the stories written long before his birth, the tales of Abraham and Isaac, of Jacob and Joseph, of Moses who led his people through parted seas. These were not just memories for him. They were living promises, proof that the God of his fathers was still the God of his own life. And though his brothers might laugh at his youth, and though men of war might dismiss him as a boy of fields and sheep, David held in his heart a certainty that God saw him fully, not as small or weak, but as chosen in his time. On warm afternoons, he would sit upon a rock above the grazing fields, his sling resting across his knees, his lyre at his side. The sun would drape him in golden light, and his eyes would drift upward. In those quiet hours, words of prayer fell from his lips like dew. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. They were not yet written as scripture, not yet etched into the memory of countless generations. They were simply the thoughts of a shepherd boy who knew the nearness of his God. At night, when the flock gathered within stone walls for safety, David lay with his cloak as cover, his head upon his arm, and the sky above like a cathedral of stars. He listened to the silence between the cricket's song, to the faint rustle of wind along the hills. And in that silence he felt something greater than himself, a presence that neither slumbered nor slept, a watchful eye that guarded Israel just as surely as he guarded his sheep. In that presence, fear dissolved into trust, and loneliness dissolved into companionship. The days repeated with gentle consistency. Morning came. Sheep followed paths well known. Stones were chosen and slung in practice. Melodies drifted upward to heaven. Night fell with the stars returning as faithful friends. Such was the life of young David, humble in appearance, but rich in spirit. His hands carried the calluses of work, yet his heart carried the tenderness of song. He knew both the strength of discipline and the gentleness of worship. The world beyond his pastures was large. Armies gathered. Kings sat upon thrones. Kingdoms rose and fell in the noise of power. Yet David's world was small. A sling, a lyre, a flock, a sky. And in that smallness he found greatness. For the God who shaped galaxies and thunder chose to dwell with a shepherd boy in quiet fields. And so David grew, not in stature alone, but in faith. The hills became his sanctuary. The sheep became his responsibility. The songs became his prayers. And the God who heard them all was preparing him, shaping him quietly, though no one around him could yet see it. The hand of the Almighty was weaving courage into his spirit. Stone by stone, song by song, night by night, and while armies prepared elsewhere, while kings brooded in their tents, the boy shepherd of Bethlehem learned the deepest lesson of all: that true strength is not in the size of a man, but in the depth of his faith. Beyond David's quiet pastures, the land began to stir with unease. Whispers moved from village to village that the Philistines were gathering their armies once more. Men who had been tending fields now stood at the edge of valleys with spears in hand. And fathers looked long at their children before setting out toward the mustering places. The valley of Elah lay open between two ridges, wide and unshielded. On one side, Israel's tents spread in rough lines, cook fires curling smoke into the morning air, shields stacked beside spears. On the opposite ridge the Philistines camped, their weapons heavier, their voices louder. Between them ran a shallow brook, patient and unhurried, smoothing stones as if it knew nothing of men and their pride. King Saul moved among his men with the weight of a crown heavy upon him. He listened to scouts who traced enemy numbers into the dust with quick fingers. He heard armor being adjusted again and again, not for need but for nerves. He saw young soldiers try to steady their hands by sharpening blades already sharp. Fear moved quietly among them, not spoken aloud but known. Across the valley the Philistine confidence was clear. Their warriors trained loudly. Their banners snapped in the wind. Among them walked a figure taller and broader than the rest, a shadow of iron and pride. His presence was felt even before his name was spoken. At night the stars shone over both camps the same. From Israel's tents came soft psalms, songs mothers had taught their children, now sung by men to steady their hearts. From the Philistine ridge came harsh laughter, bold but edged with restlessness. The fires on each side burned, but their light told two very different stories. The days stretched into waiting. Each dawn revealed the same valley floor, unbroken, untouched, holding the weight of two nations staring across at one another. The air felt thick with a question not yet answered. The tension pressed like the stillness before a storm. And somewhere, not far away, a shepherd boy tended his flock beneath the same sky. He had not yet seen this valley, had not yet heard the name of the giant who troubled it. But his path and this gathering of armies were moving steadily toward one another. The moment of meeting drew closer. Though neither army could yet see how courage would arrive. The stage was set. The valley waiting. Israel's fear had taken shape in the shadow of a single man. And soon his challenge would thunder across the quiet. Morning broke upon the valley of Elah. The mist lifted slowly, like a veil being drawn back, revealing the armies that faced one another across the open plain. Israel's men stood on one ridge, their spears catching the first light, but their hearts heavy with dread. Across the valley, the Philistine camp bristled with confidence. Shields gleaming, banners snapping in the wind. And then, from their line, a figure emerged. He was taller than any man Israel had seen. His frame vast, his steps heavy, his presence enough to make the ground itself seem smaller. He was clothed in armor that flashed with cruel beauty. A bronze helmet covered his head, his chest encased in scales of iron that clinked with each movement like the hiss of a serpent. A spear rested in his hand, its shaft thick as a weaver's beam, its tip like a sharpened star. His name was Goliath of Gath. He walked forward into the valley as if it belonged to him alone. Each step measured, deliberate, echoing across the floor of earth. When he stopped, his voice rolled like thunder between the ridges. He mocked Israel. He mocked their king. And worst of all, he mocked their God. His words carried scorn, daring any man to face him in single combat. Israel's warriors trembled. Even the bravest among them lowered their eyes. For this man was not only strong, he was a giant. His very stature seemed to strip courage from their bones. The line of soldiers wavered, hearts sinking as the challenge rang again and again. Day after day he appeared. Morning and evening his voice broke the silence of the valley. Send out a man to fight me. If he prevails, we will serve you. But if I prevail, you will serve us. His taunts grew sharper, his laughter crueler. Each word was a blade slicing into the resolve of Israel's camp. King Saul, though tall among his people, felt the weight of fear press hard upon him. Once he had known the Spirit's strength within him. Once he had led with boldness. But now he stood silent, watching, searching for courage and finding only trembling in the faces of his men. Across the lines, the Philistines grew bold. Their cheers followed Goliath's challenge like waves breaking against rock. They trusted in his size, his power, his armor. They believed the valley already belonged to them. The brook that divided the armies flowed on quietly, smoothing its stones as it had for ages. The hills stood unmoved. Yet in the hearts of Israel's soldiers, the ground felt unsteady. For who among them could face such a man? Who among them dared to step forward when every instinct whispered to shrink back? Each new appearance of Goliath deepened the shadow across the camp. Hope seemed smaller with every passing day. The sound of his voice carried into the night, lingering in memory, turning even dreams restless. And yet, while fear grew tall in the valley, faith was waiting quietly beyond it. A shepherd boy still tended his flock in the hills near Bethlehem. He did not know yet that his path was being woven toward this very place. He did not know that the stones of the brook would soon rest in his hand. But the God who heard his songs beneath the stars was preparing him. The giant's challenge filled the air. Israel trembled. The valley waited. And the story was about to turn toward an answer no one expected. For in a world weighed down by size and strength, heaven was ready to show that faith is greater, and that a boy's trust in God would one day silence a giant's roar. The days of Goliath's taunts stretched on. Morning and evening his voice thundered through the valley. Daring, mocking, unraveling courage. Israel's camp grew heavy with silence. Men sharpened their blades not in hope but in habit. They stood in their lines, yet their eyes often turned away from the giant's shadow. And in the hills beyond, where the sounds of war had not yet reached, a shepherd boy tended his flock. David, son of Jesse, was still the youngest of his brothers. His life had remained with sheep, song, and sling. But even shepherd boys belong to families that feel the weight of war. One morning his father called him from the pasture. Jesse, an old man by then, worried for his older sons who served in Saul's army. He baked bread, gathered roasted grain, and prepared cheeses for them. Into David's hands he placed these provisions. Go to your brothers in the camp. Carry these gifts to the commander. Bring back news of how they fare. So David left the quiet hills. He rose early, entrusted the flock to another's care, and walked the road that bent toward Elah. The path wound through villages, where talk of the Philistines was heavy. Farmers paused in their work to share the latest rumor. Children listened wide-eyed as travelers described the towering man who challenged Israel. And with each step, David's curiosity grew. Not with fear, but with a stirring he did not yet name. At last he reached the outskirts of the valley. The sound of the camp carried on the air. The clatter of weapons. The shuffle of restless feet. The low murmur of weary voices. He hurried toward the lines, the bread and cheese still upon his shoulders. When he arrived, his brothers were surprised to see him. Some welcomed the food with gratitude, but his eldest brother's eyes narrowed. Eliab, tall and stern, rebuked him. Why have you come here? Shouldn't you be with the sheep? Your heart is proud, David. You only came to see the battle. But David's eyes had already turned toward the valley. For even as Eliab scolded, the giant's voice rose again. Goliath stepped forward, his words cutting through the air. Mockery poured like a storm, belittling Israel and defying the God they served. David listened, and something within him tightened. Not with fear, but with conviction. Around him, soldiers shrank back as they had on every day before. Some looked at the ground, others at the sky. None moved forward. Their silence was heavier than armor. David, still young and untested in war, felt his spirit burn. "Who is this Philistine," he asked quietly, "that he should defy the armies of the living God?" Men near him turned in surprise. They had grown accustomed to trembling. To hear such words from a youth startled them. They whispered among themselves. Some laughed, others shook their heads. Yet the words spread quickly, carried from tent to tent. David's brothers grew angry at his boldness. "Be silent. You do not understand what you say." But David did not argue with them. His eyes remained fixed on the giant's figure across the valley. His heart remained fixed on the God who had delivered him before. The camp swirled with tension. Some dismissed him as a child. Others repeated his words with a faint thread of hope. And in the midst of it, the challenge of Goliath still rang, unanswered. David had come with bread and cheese. But he had also come with faith. A faith that would not sit silent before mockery. A faith that looked at a giant and remembered a God greater still. The camp of Israel trembled each morning and evening. For 40 days, the voice of Goliath had thundered across the valley. His words mocked, his stature threatened, and the soldiers of Saul grew smaller in their own eyes. Each day they hoped another would rise to answer, but none dared to step forward. Courage thinned like smoke scattered by wind. But into that heavy silence stepped a shepherd boy. His sling was tucked at his side, his hands still rough from tending sheep. He had not been trained in Saul's ranks, had never stood in the ordered line of soldiers. Yet his spirit carried something the camp had forgotten. Faith that had been forged not in battlefields, but in the quiet hills of Bethlehem. David's words spread quickly. "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?" The sentence was simple, but it carried weight. It was not the boast of a boy eager for glory. It was the conviction of one who had walked long with God in silence, under the stars, with only sheep for company. When men mocked him, David did not waver. When his eldest brother accused him of pride, David did not shrink. For his heart was not stirred by vanity. It was stirred by the memory of the God who had never failed him. He remembered the nights when danger crept near the flock. The rustle of a lion's paws in the dark, the growl of a bear from behind the rocks. Fear could have mastered him then, yet it had not. For in those hours, David had reached for his sling, and with steady hand and steady trust, he had struck down the threat. He had rescued the lamb from its jaws, torn it from danger, and returned it to safety. His hands were young, but they were not untested. His courage was not imagined. It had been lived in fields far from the notice of kings. But even those victories, David knew, were not his own. He had not slain lion or bear by his strength. It was the Lord who had delivered him. As the night sky had covered him with its vastness, so the Almighty had covered him with protection. Each stone he had slung was guided by more than practice. Each strike was a testimony of God's nearness. So when David looked at Goliath, he did not see a giant too large to fight. He saw an enemy too small to stand against the living God. Where others measured height and weight, armor and spear, David measured faith. And in that measure, Israel's God outweighed the Philistine 1,000 times. Word reached King Saul. They told him of the shepherd boy's boldness. And Saul, weary and troubled, summoned him. David stood before the king, not in trembling but in calm assurance. His stature was small, his youth undeniable. Yet his words carried more steadiness than the armor that lined Saul's tent. Let no one's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine. Saul looked long at the boy. He had seen fear in the eyes of seasoned men, yet here was one untried who spoke with peace. You are not able, Saul told him. You are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. But David's reply came gentle, without boast. He told of the lion, the bear, the nights of battle fought in shadows where only God and sheep were witness. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. The king fell silent. His doubts were not erased, but he could not deny the fire in David's words. It was not reckless fire. It was faith that had been tested, quiet faith that had grown roots deep enough to withstand fear. Saul offered his armor, heavy bronze and iron fitted for a king. They placed it upon David, strapped the sword to his side. But the boy moved and found himself burdened. His steps were stiff, his arms weighed down. He shook his head gently. I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. He laid them aside, choosing instead the simplicity of sling and staff. This was the heart of his faith. Trust not in the weapons of men, but in the name of the Lord. Trust not in weight of armor, but in the God who clothes his servants with courage. David stepped from the tent with nothing more than what he had always carried. A sling, a staff, a heart tuned to worship, and a faith that did not bend before giants. The camp watched him. Some shook their heads. Others whispered. But in their hearts a flicker stirred. For in his youth, they saw a courage they had forgotten in their age. Faith often looks foolish to fear. Yet in that foolishness lies a strength unshakable. David walked toward the brook. The sun touched his shoulders, the wind brushed against him. His steps were steady, his heart unhurried. He did not race toward battle. He moved as he had always moved among the sheep, confident in the one who guided his steps. And though the giant still mocked, though his voice still shook the valley, David's faith stood taller than Goliath's frame. For his trust was not in stone or sling. It was in the living God who never fails his own. The valley had grown accustomed to fear. For every morning and every evening, the shadow of Goliath stretched long across the land. His voice thundered, and the soldiers of Israel turned their faces away. For 40 days, no answer had come. Courage seemed buried under the weight of silence. And now David stood before King Saul. A shepherd boy. Unarmored. Untrained in the arts of war. His youth was plain to see, yet his words carried a fire the king had not heard in many days. Saul studied him with weary eyes. He saw a boy's frame, but he also saw a heart unwilling to bow before the Philistine giant. The king had once known such fire. In the early days of his reign, the Spirit of the Lord had come upon him like a rushing wind. He had led his people boldly, fought battles with strength not his own. But years of burden, disobedience, and fear had dulled his spirit. Now he hesitated. For even as David spoke of lions and bears defeated, Saul's mind returned always to the sight of the Philistine's towering form. "Take my armor," Saul said at last. His servants brought forth the helmet, the coat of mail, the sword. They dressed David in them, fastening straps, securing buckles. The bronze gleamed against his young shoulders. But David walked a few steps and shook his head. The weight pressed him down. The sword felt foreign in his hand. He turned to the king and spoke gently. "I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them." He laid the armor aside. The clang of bronze echoed in the tent. Saul watched, torn between disbelief and wonder. For every man he had known placed confidence in armor, in shield, in the forged strength of iron. Yet this boy refused it all. David lifted his staff, worn smooth by shepherds' hands. At his side hung the sling he had carried for years. "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear," David said, his voice calm, "will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul hesitated. His reason wrestled with doubt. Yet something in David's words pressed against his heart. The boy's faith shone with a clarity the king had long forgotten. Saul, weary and uncertain, finally nodded. "Go," he said, "and the Lord be with you." The tent fell silent. Soldiers whispered among themselves. Some shook their heads, certain this was folly. Others felt a stir of hope, faint but alive. David left Saul's presence, not clothed in iron but clothed in faith. The king remained behind. His hesitation lingered. For he knew this boy's courage might shame the fear of all his men. And in his heart he wondered if God had chosen another to carry the courage he had lost. And so, the shepherd stepped forward with faith alone, while the king sat in the shadow of doubt. One hesitant, one steadfast. And the valley itself seemed to wait for the outcome of their choices. David stepped out from Saul's tent. The weight of armor no longer pressed on his shoulders. Instead, he carried the lightness of trust. The sun had climbed higher above the valley, its rays touching the ridges and glimmering faintly on the brook that wound its way between the armies. The murmur of soldiers followed him. Some mocked, others whispered, but all eyes turned to watch the shepherd boy who dared where none else had. He walked slowly down the slope, his staff in hand, sling at his side. The earth beneath him crunched with each step, dust rising like faint smoke. Across the valley, the Philistines stirred, their laughter carrying on the wind. Goliath loomed among them, his armor flashing, his shadow stretching wide. Yet David's gaze was not fixed on the giant. His eyes turned instead to the water that sang quietly in the brook. The brook was calm. It had flowed long before this day and would flow long after. Its waters glistened as though heaven itself had poured them into the valley. David knelt at its edge, the murmur of the current soft against his ears. He placed his hand into the cool stream. Water parted around his fingers, slipping away in endless motion. And there, among the bed of smooth stones, he searched. He lifted one stone, round and polished by years of patience. He turned it in his palm, feeling its weight. It was not large, not sharp, not remarkable to the eyes of men. Yet in its simplicity lay the very strength David sought. For God's power did not require what was mighty in the eyes of the world. He placed the stone into his pouch. Again he reached. Another smooth stone, shaped by countless seasons of flowing water. It too found its place in his pouch. Then another, and another, until 5 stones rested within. Each one ordinary. Each one prepared not by forge or hammer, but by the slow work of time and the hand of God who had watched them shaped in secret. As David rose, the brook whispered on. To the soldiers who watched, it seemed foolish. A boy with 5 stones against a warrior armored in bronze. But to David, it was enough. For his faith did not rest in the stones, nor in the sling. His trust was in the Lord who had delivered him before and who would deliver him again. The breeze stirred as he turned back toward the valley floor. His steps were steady. The stones pressed lightly against his side, each one a quiet reminder. Not of his skill, but of God's faithfulness. The armies above watched in silence. The Philistines laughed, the Israelites held their breath. And in the stillness between them, David walked with peace. For the stones in his pouch were not just weapons. They were symbols of patience, of faith, of trust in a God who uses the simple to confound the mighty. And as the shepherd boy straightened his shoulders and stepped forward, heaven itself seemed to lean nearer, ready for what was to come. The valley lay quiet for a moment, as though the earth itself had drawn in a deep breath and held it. On one ridge, the army of Israel stood in heavy silence, their eyes following the small figure who now walked steadily toward the open ground. On the opposite ridge, the Philistines gathered, laughter beginning to rise like a wave. And between them both, the boy shepherd carried only a sling, a staff, and the faith of his God. The sun burned brighter above, casting long shadows across the valley floor. Dust swirled gently around David's sandals as he stepped onto the plain. His pouch of stones pressed lightly at his side, each one waiting in quiet patience. He did not rush. He did not falter. His steps carried the same calm rhythm he had known when walking his flock through narrow passes and rocky slopes. From the Philistine line, Goliath moved forward. The giant's armor clattered, a sound like grinding thunder echoing against the rocks. His helmet gleamed, his spear tipped with iron long as a man's arm. He towered above all, the very picture of strength and terror. The laughter of his people roared behind him, mocking the sight of Israel's answer. For what was this? A boy. Bareheaded, unarmored, carrying no sword. Goliath's voice rolled across the valley. Am I a dog, that you come to me with sticks? His words dripped with scorn. He cursed David by his gods, and with every sentence the Philistines shouted in agreement. Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. His threats struck the ears of Israel, and many men lowered their heads in shame. But David did not shrink. He lifted his eyes toward the giant and spoke words that carried further than his youth should have allowed. You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand. And all the earth will know that there is a God in Israel. The air trembled. The Philistines scoffed, yet a flicker passed through Israel's camp. For the boy's voice carried not fear, but faith. Not arrogance, but certainty in the one who had never failed him. The two figures stood across the plain. One clothed in iron and pride. The other clothed in humility and trust. Around them the ridges seemed to fade. The soldiers, the banners, the shouts all blurred into the background. The valley became a stage for a single truth: that the battle does not belong to the strong, nor the mighty, nor those with weapons of war. The battle belongs to the Lord. David placed a stone into his sling. The leather cords hung ready in his hand. His eyes did not waver. His heart did not shake. The valley was no longer a place of fear. It was a place of decision. And faith had already decided the outcome. The armies leaned forward. The giant thundered his steps. The boy raised his sling. And heaven itself seemed to bend close to watch. The giant advanced, his armor rattling like a storm of iron. Each step pressed deep into the soil of the valley. The earth itself seemed to tremble beneath his weight. His shield-bearer walked ahead of him, struggling to keep pace with such vast strides. The spear in Goliath's hand gleamed with menace, its point sharp as a blade of lightning. On the ridges, Israel's men looked on with dread. Some turned away, unable to watch. Others held their breath, certain that the boy would be crushed in moments. Across the valley, the Philistines shouted with laughter and scorn. To them, this was no contest. A giant against a shepherd. a seasoned warrior against a youth with no armor. But David's spirit did not bend. His feet stood steady, planted in faith. He lifted his voice, and the words he spoke rang through the air with a strength greater than steel. You come to me with sword and spear and javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand. I will strike you down, and I will cut off your head. And I will give the bodies of the Philistine host this day to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. His words rolled across the plain. Israel's soldiers stirred, their hearts quickened by the courage of one boy. The Philistines jeered, but their jeers carried a faint edge of unease. For David's voice was not that of a child boasting. It was the voice of a servant of God declaring what heaven had already decided. David's sling hung at his side. His hand rested upon the stones in his pouch. He looked at Goliath not with fear but with unshaken trust. For he knew the truth that echoed through his words. The battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. The ridges held their silence. The armies hushed as though time itself had paused. One boy, one giant, one God. The wind stirred lightly through the valley. Dust lifted and swirled. The brook whispered its steady song. And in that sacred stillness, David's faith spoke louder than Goliath's roar. The words had been spoken. The decision was sealed. All that remained was for faith to become sight, and for the hand of God to prove stronger than the pride of man. The moment had come. The armies held their breath. The ridges, the tents, the banners, all seemed to fade into stillness. In the open space of the valley stood two figures. One immense and armored in bronze, the other small and robed in the simplicity of a shepherd. Goliath roared, raising his spear, his steps pounding like thunder across the plain. But David's steps were light, steady. His eyes fixed not on the size of the giant, but on the strength of his God. He reached into his pouch. His fingers closed around one of the smooth stones, chosen carefully from the brook's whispering waters. He placed it into the sling, leather cords resting in his hand. The weapon was simple, common, unimpressive to those who watched. But David knew it well. It was the tool of his shepherd's life, the skill honed through countless hours in the hills. And more than that, it was a vessel ready to be used by the Lord who guided his hand. The giant laughed, his scorn echoing through the valley. He cursed David again, mocked him as if this battle were already finished. But David did not answer with words. His silence was stronger than any insult. He lifted the sling, began to swing it in a slow circle, round and round, the cords cutting softly through the air. The sound grew swifter, the circle tighter, the stone gathering speed. It was no longer a boy standing with a strip of leather. It was faith in motion. A prayer given shape in the air. Goliath raised his shield and advanced, confident, unafraid. His armor gleamed, his shadow stretched long. The Philistines roared behind him, Israel's camp fell silent. And then, in one sure motion, David released the sling. The stone flew. Small, unremarkable, yet carried on the breath of heaven itself. It cut through the air with the precision of eternity. The armies watched, their eyes following its unseen line. It struck the giant's forehead. The sound rang sharp. Armor and pride could not shield him. His mocking voice broke into silence. For a moment the valley seemed to hold its breath again. Then Goliath staggered. His great frame swayed. And with a crash that shook the dust from the ground, the mighty warrior fell upon his face. The Philistines gasped, their laughter cut short. Israel's soldiers blinked, unable to believe what their eyes had seen. One stone. One sling. One God. And the giant who had defied them for 40 days lay silent upon the earth. David lowered his sling. His hand still steady. His heart still fixed in quiet trust. He had not boasted, he had not trembled. He had simply acted in faith. And faith had triumphed where fear had reigned. The sling hung quiet at his side once more. The stone had found its mark. And in that moment the valley of Elah became holy ground. For it was no longer the place where Israel trembled. It became the place where God's power was revealed through the hand of a shepherd boy. For a long heartbeat the valley forgot how to breathe. Dust hung in the air where the giant had fallen. A pale veil drifting slowly down over armor that no longer moved. The echo of his crash rolled away into the hills like a spent wave, leaving behind a quiet so deep that even the brook seemed to pause between syllables. Men who had braced for the final blow now stood strangely weightless, as if the ground beneath their feet had lifted an inch closer to heaven and then held still. On Israel's ridge, faces turned from dread to wonder. Helmets tilted as if to let the ears listen better. Though there was nothing to hear except wind and the soft rattle of loosened mail. Hands that had clenched spears relaxed by habit, then tightened again. Unsure whether to shout or to kneel. In many eyes a brightness gathered. Not the glitter of triumph, but the dawning of recognition. Something holy had crossed the valley on the path of a single stone, and it had rearranged the courage in 1,000 hearts. Across the plain the Philistines stared at the emptiness where pride had stood moments before. Mouths once curved in laughter flattened to lines. Shields that had rung in rhythm with their champions' insults now dulled in their bearers' numb hands. They measured the distance between what they had believed and what they now saw, and could not span it. For a giant had seemed as certain as a mountain. And yet mountains do not fall with a whisper of leather and a boy's steady breath. David stood still. The sling hung quiet from his fingers. The pouch at his side no lighter to him than before. Though one stone had flown and found its purpose. He did not speak. He did not lift his arms as if to claim the valley, nor beat his chest as if victory were a noise owed to him. The shepherd stood as he had stood on many evenings when the flock had settled and the stars had begun their patient procession. Calm, present, held by the same presence that had guided the stone. The shield-bearer of Goliath backed away as if from a cliff's sudden edge. His steps found no pattern, for the world had changed its measures beneath him. He glanced to his own line for instruction and found only mirrored uncertainty. To move forward felt like defiance of fate. To run felt like proclaiming it aloud. He chose neither. He simply stepped aside from the fallen mass and let silence speak in his place. Along Israel's ridge the first sound returned. It was not a shout. It was the bare breath of a prayer released after being held too long. Then another. And another. The murmurs braided into a low tide of gratitude. The kind that knows words are small and still tries to offer them. A few men took a step forward without meaning to, pulled by the sight of fear's undoing. Their feet learned the valley's slope like children learning a melody. Hesitantly at first, then with a little more trust. Saul watched from his place, and the tension that had sat upon his shoulders like an iron yoke loosened by a notch. He did not yet understand what this moment would mean for him. Only that it was larger than his command and kinder than his doubt. In the narrow chamber of his chest, space opened for breath that had been withheld for 40 days. He let it out slowly, as if fearing the sight might vanish if exhaled too quickly. The wind turned and lifted a corner of Goliath's cloak. It flapped once and lay still. A raven crossed the sky and did not descend. Even the creatures seemed to sense that the valley had become a sanctuary where noise must wait its turn. The brook found its voice again and spoke in gentle present tense. It named the stones by touch alone, not one more important than the others, each rounded by the same patient hands of time. Somewhere near the front line of Israel stood a soldier whose son had asked him, before he left home, if giants were real. He had answered then with the honesty of a father. Yes, some men are very large and very loud. Now he framed a new answer within himself. Giants are real, but they are not forever. The soldier felt the thought settle like a seed under good soil. He closed his eyes for a moment and saw the boy's face. And in that vision was tomorrow's courage beginning to grow. The Philistines shifted at last. A ripple ran along their ranks like grass bowing to a sudden gust. Some stepped back, then more. And the motion taught the rest what to do without teaching them why. Their confidence had been stacked carefully upon a single pillar. And when that pillar fell, every plank leaned toward retreat. Not with discipline at first, simply with the survival instinct that admits what the tongue refuses to say. David moved then, not with haste, not with hesitation. His steps drew him to the fallen figure. The ground carried his weight the way it always had, unastonished by victory, welcoming any who walked it with honest feet. He stood beside the giant who had named himself master of the valley, and for a moment looked down at the quiet of that great frame. There was no joy in the fall itself, only awe at the faithfulness that had brought it about. Israel's breath gathered into courage. Banners steadied. Knees straightened. The slope that had seemed to tilt away from them now tilted toward them. Men found one another's eyes and passed a message without speaking. If a boy could trust like this, then grown men could remember how. If God could answer a sling, then God could answer a shout. The first cry rose, not violent, simply full. It rolled across the ridge and slid down into the valley like light following dawn. The Philistines heard that cry and knew its meaning without translation. They had heard such sounds before when tides turned and stories rewrote themselves mid-sentence. Their line loosened into a wave that broke backward. Some threw spears to the ground to unburden their flight. Some turned and ran with their shields still strapped. Some looked over their shoulders as if the sight might correct itself if seen from another angle. But history had already chosen its path. Yet before pursuit, before the chase and the clamor, there was this, a still point where shock yielded to understanding and understanding bowed to worship. In that breath-long sanctuary, the valley remembered what it had always known. Strength is not the loudest voice. Height is not the deepest root. The earth belongs to the one who made it. And he is not impressed by iron or undone by mockery. He gathers small things and writes great endings with them. David lifted his gaze toward Israel's ridge. He did not beckon them. He did not command. He simply stood as a witness to what God had done. And in the standing, he became a doorway through which a nation could walk from fear to faith. Behind him the giant lay as a monument to the moment when heaven touched ground and the ground agreed to tell the story forever. Shock had finished its work. Silence had spoken its last, and the valley prepared to fill with footsteps. But even as noise returned, a quiet truth rooted in the hearts of all who had seen it. The greatest sound that day was not the fall of a giant, nor the roar of an army finding its voice. It was the soft release of fear from 1,000 chests, leaving room for faith to breathe again. The silence of the valley broke at last. It began as a murmur on Israel's ridge, like the first stirrings of wind in still branches. Then came a shout, one voice rising, another joining, until the hillside thundered with the cry of men whose courage had returned. The sound rolled across the valley like a tide, swelling, crashing against the ears of the Philistines. And fear, which had once gripped Israel, now ran swiftly into the hearts of their enemies. The Philistines scattered. Shields slipped from their hands, spears clattered upon the stones. Their lines wavered, then shattered, as men fled toward the road that led to Gath and Ekron. Dust rose in frantic clouds as sandals beat the ground in retreat. The pride of their army had fallen, and with him fell their confidence. For their strength had been bound to the giant, and when he lay still, their spirit lay broken beside him. Israel surged forward. Men who had trembled moments before now ran with renewed fire. Their voices lifted in triumph, echoing from ridge to ridge. Spears flashed, shields rang, the dust of pursuit swirled across the valley floor. They drove their enemies back, chasing them as far as the gates of their cities. The cry of victory was no longer timid. It was bold, certain, alive. David stood quietly amid the rising storm of triumph. He bent and took hold of the giant's massive sword. It was heavy in his hand, far larger than any weapon he had ever lifted. With one sure motion, he struck, and the head of Goliath was severed from his great body. The valley that had once echoed with the giant's mocking voice now echoed with the silence of his defeat. The Philistines saw it from afar, and their terror deepened. Israel saw it, and their courage burned brighter. For the boy who had stepped forward with nothing but faith now stood as proof that the Lord delivers. The spoil of the enemy's camp was gathered. Tents abandoned, weapons left behind, treasures scattered in haste. Israel's men carried them away, rejoicing. Yet even in their triumph, all eyes turned back to David. For in him they saw the hand of God revealed. Not in a warrior's frame, not in a king's armor, but in a shepherd's faith. David did not boast. He did not raise his arms to claim glory for himself. He lifted his gaze heavenward, his heart swelling not with pride but with thanksgiving. For he knew the truth as clearly as the stone had flown. The victory was not his. It belonged to the Lord. Saul watched with wonder. His eyes followed the boy who had succeeded where all his men had faltered. In his heart stirred both gratitude and unease. Gratitude for deliverance, unease for what this shepherd might one day become. Yet for that moment, even Saul could not deny the miracle he had witnessed. The valley of Elah, once filled with fear, was now marked by triumph. No longer the place where Israel trembled, it had become the place where God's name was lifted high. And as the sun began to set behind the hills, its light falling gently upon the still brook, the valley bore witness to a timeless truth. That no giant is greater than the God of Israel. And that victory, when given by his hand, belongs not to the mighty, but to the faithful. The valley still echoed with the cries of victory. The Philistines had fled, their weapons scattered like dry leaves in the wind. Israel's soldiers rejoiced, their fear turned to boldness, their shame to triumph. Yet in the midst of the noise, David stood quiet. His sling now empty, his pouch lighter by one stone. He did not raise his arms to claim glory, nor did he shout among the men. He simply breathed, steady and calm, as one who knew the truth. The victory was not his. It belonged to the Lord. The giant's sword, still heavy in his hands, rested now upon the ground. The weight of it reminded him how small he was. How impossible this moment should have been. He lifted his eyes toward the sky, where clouds drifted slowly, unshaken by the clash of men. In his heart rose not pride, but gratitude. For he remembered the nights in the fields when danger had come close. He remembered the lion, the bear. He remembered how God had always been near. And now, before the watching armies of two nations, that same God had proven faithful once more. Israel's soldiers gathered around him, voices praising, eyes wide with awe. Some reached to touch his shoulders as if to assure themselves he was real. Others bowed their heads, murmuring prayers of thanks. But David's own heart did not swell with their praise. He thought only of the one who had guided the stone, the one who had steadied his hand. Saul's men carried the news quickly. Messengers sped across the land, telling of the boy who had faced the giant. In villages, mothers would weep with joy, fathers would lift their heads in pride, children would listen wide-eyed to the story told again and again. Yet David did not seek their applause. He returned quietly with the head of the fallen giant, not as a trophy for himself, but as a witness to what the Lord had done. When Saul summoned him, the king looked at him long. The boy stood before him still dressed in simple shepherd's clothes, without armor, without splendor. His hands bore no crown, his brow no laurel. Only faith marked his face. Saul asked, "Whose son are you, young man?" And David answered with humility, "I am the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem." No boast. No claim to greatness. Only the truth of who he was. A shepherd boy, son of a father who tended sheep and fields. David's humility was not weakness. It was strength. For pride builds upon sand, but humility stands upon rock. Pride takes glory for itself, but humility gives glory back to God. And in giving, it is never empty. As the sun sank lower, casting the valley in golden glow, David's figure seemed smaller among the soldiers. Yet his faith had lifted an entire nation. His name was beginning to be known, yet his heart remained bowed. For David knew. Giants may fall in a moment, but the true victory is won when the heart remembers who holds the battle. And so he stood not as a hero seeking honor, but as a servant offering thanks. When the dust of battle had settled, when the Philistines had vanished into retreat and Israel's men had gathered the spoils, King Saul called for the shepherd who had silenced a giant. David was brought into the royal tent, still clothed in his simple garments, his sling resting quietly at his side. In his hands, he carried the weighty proof of victory. Goliath's sword, gleaming and massive, lay before the king. Saul's eyes searched the boy's face. He saw no boast, no pride. Only calm, steady humility. It puzzled him. For in his years as king, he had known men who longed for glory, who swelled with pride after the smallest victory. But this youth spoke softly, standing with the composure of one who did not claim triumph for himself. "Whose son are you?" Saul asked again, though he already knew the answer. His voice carried both wonder and unease. David bowed his head. "I am the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem." His words were simple, his tone respectful. He made no claim of destiny, no demand for reward. He spoke as a servant, though the hand of God upon him was unmistakable. Saul felt a stirring within. Gratitude that the Lord had delivered Israel through this boy. But also a shadow of unease. For in David's presence, he sensed something he could not name. A favor that once had rested upon his own life now seemed to rest on the shepherd. A courage he had lost now shone brightly in another. Jonathan, Saul's son, stood near his father. His heart was moved at the sight of David. In the shepherd he saw a kindred spirit. Courage without arrogance. Faith without fear. Jonathan loved him at once, and in the days that followed, he would bind his soul to David's with covenant and friendship. But for now, he simply looked with admiration, his heart echoing with quiet loyalty. The soldiers of Israel, too, whispered David's name. Some repeated the story of the sling and the stone. Others marveled that such a boy had done what warriors could not. The camp, once heavy with dread, now breathed in freedom. But David's heart remained unchanged. He sought no throne, no title. He sought only to serve the God who had delivered him. Saul, however, felt the tension within himself. The people's praise for David would grow. Their songs would one day lift his name above the king's. And though this moment was filled with victory, Saul's heart already trembled with jealousy he did not yet speak aloud. For now, he placed David near him, welcoming him into his court. Yet beneath his welcome, unease lingered like a shadow at sunset. The shepherd who had slain a giant was now at the king's side. And in that truth lay the beginning of a story far larger than the valley of Elah. The day closed with celebration, but also with mystery. For God had raised up a boy to silence a giant. And in doing so, he had begun to raise up the one who would one day be king. The victory at Elah did not fade quickly. The dust of the battlefield settled, but the memory of what had happened lingered like a fire that refused to die. Across Israel, voices carried the story from one town to the next. Shepherds told it by their fires at night, farmers repeated it in the fields at dawn, and mothers spoke of it while kneading bread at their tables. Always the tale began with fear, with the shadow of the giant. And always it ended with a boy's faith that silenced that fear forever. For many, the story became more than history. It was a lesson etched into the heart. "Do you remember," they would say, "how a boy, untrained, unarmed, stepped forward when no one else would? How he faced the giant not with sword or shield, but with trust in the living God." Children listened wide-eyed, learning before they were strong that courage is not born in the size of the arm but in the size of the faith within the heart. In Saul's court, the name of David began to stir admiration and envy alike. Some saw him as a hero, others as a threat. But among the people, he was remembered with joy. For he had reminded them of something they had almost forgotten. That the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was still their deliverer, still present in their valleys, still faithful when giants rose to mock them. Even the soldiers, hardened by fear, carried the memory as a shield for their own hearts. They had seen with their own eyes that the impossible can fall in a single moment when the Lord chooses. They had heard the crash of pride turned into silence. And they knew now that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to trust God while fear still speaks loudly. The brook in the valley whispered on, smoothing stones as it always had. Travelers passed and pointed toward the place where the giant had fallen. Children would stoop to gather their own stones, placing them in pouches, pretending to face their own imagined foes. And elders would smile gently, knowing that one day those children would learn what the story truly meant. That faith is not pretend. It is the strongest stone of all. In Bethlehem, Jesse marveled at the son he had once sent with bread and cheese. He had not raised him for the courts of kings, nor for the fields of battle. Yet God had written a larger story upon David's life. And though Jesse could not see where that story would lead, he gave thanks that his boy had been faithful in small things. For it was faith in the pasture that had prepared faith in the valley. Generations later, the story would still be told. The names of kings and warriors might fade, but David's courage would remain, carried in the hearts of all who believed. In times of trouble, mothers would remind their children, "Do you remember David and the giant? Remember how the Lord is greater than any fear." In times of despair, fathers would say, "God is still the God of David. And He is still the God who helps us." The courage of that single act stretched far beyond the valley of Elah. It became a river flowing through time, refreshing every soul who paused to drink from it. It spoke across centuries to remind all who heard, faith does not measure the size of the enemy, it measures the greatness of God. And so David's courage was remembered. Not as the courage of a warrior who trusted his own strength, but as the courage of a shepherd who trusted the Lord. And that memory, carried in gentle whispers and steadfast songs, became an inheritance for all who believe. Long after the dust of Elah had settled, long after Goliath's armor had grown cold and silent, the story of David's victory began to ripple outward, carried on the tongues of men and women, sung in fields and remembered in courtyards. It was not just a tale of battle. It was a thread woven into the fabric of Israel's memory. A reminder that courage found in God could never be silenced. In villages, elders gathered children at evening fires. They told of the days when Israel's soldiers trembled at the voice of a giant. Of how no warrior, no captain, not even the king, dared to step forward. And then they spoke of the boy, small in stature, yet full of faith. How he walked into the valley unafraid, carrying nothing but a sling and stones. The children leaned forward, wide-eyed. They whispered the name David with wonder, and in their hearts they learned a truth that would never leave them. The story passed beyond the borders of Israel. Traders carried it on their lips as they traveled the roads toward Egypt, toward Damascus, toward distant lands where people hungered for tales of wonder. There was once a boy who slew a giant, they would begin. and even strangers, who knew nothing of the God of Israel, paused to listen. For the echo of the story was larger than one valley. It belonged to all who faced fears greater than themselves. In the courts of kings, whispers reached ears that ruled with crowns of gold. They marveled not at the fall of Goliath alone, but at the God who had given strength to the weak. Some dismissed it as legend. Others feared that a nation whose God fought so mightily for them could never be crushed. The echoes of Elah stirred unease in the hearts of enemies, and hope in the hearts of friends. Generations turned, and still the story was told. Mothers spoke it to sons who feared the darkness of night. Fathers recited it to daughters who faced burdens too heavy for their years. Priests lifted it as reminder in their prayers, declaring that the Lord is mighty to save, that no power on earth can stand against him. The psalmist himself would return to the memory in later years, weaving its courage into songs that strengthened the weary. The echoes did not fade with time. They grew softer in sound, perhaps, but deeper in meaning. The Valley of Elah was remembered not as a place of Israel's fear, but as a place of God's triumph. And every valley since then carried that memory, as if the earth itself could not forget what had happened when one boy trusted the Lord more than his own strength. Even as the years passed and David's life turned toward the throne, toward victories and trials yet to come, the story of his youth never disappeared. It became a song, a proverb, a lantern passed from hand to hand. A reminder that faith is not bound to age, to rank, or to power. It belongs to any who trust God, no matter how small they may seem in the eyes of men. And so the echoes of that day lingered through centuries. Echoing in hearts, in songs, in prayers whispered under the stars. Timeless in their message, eternal in their truth. That the battle is the Lord's. And that his strength, once revealed in the hands of a shepherd, still moves through the world for all who believe. The story of David and Goliath is more than an ancient memory. More than a tale spoken around fires or carved into the pages of Scripture. It is a mirror held before every generation. A quiet reminder that giants are not only found in valleys with armor and spears. They rise in the lives of all people. Giants of fear, of sorrow, of doubt, of burden. Each heart knows its own Goliath. There are nights when worry stands tall, its shadow stretching long across the mind. It mocks with words of defeat. You are too small, too weak, too unprepared. There are mornings when uncertainty waits like an enemy at the gate, whispering that hope has no place, that faith cannot endure. And in such moments, the story of David becomes more than history. It becomes a gentle companion, whispering courage into trembling souls. For David's faith was not in himself. It was not in sword or shield. It was in the Lord who never fails. And this same God is near to every heart today. His presence is not distant. His strength is not locked away in the past. It flows through the present as surely as a brook through the valley. Steady, constant, unbroken. Your giants may not wear armor of bronze, They may not stand with spear and javelin, yet they are real, pressing against your peace, raising voices of fear. But just as David reached into his pouch for smooth stones, so too can you reach into the promises of God. Stones of hope, stones of prayer, stones of truth, stones of trust. Each one small to the eye, but strong enough to bring down what towers over you. When you feel weak, remember that God delights to use the humble. When you feel unseen, remember that He sees the shepherd in the field before He sees the warrior in the line. When you feel overwhelmed, remember that the battle is not yours alone. The battle belongs to the Lord. And in that truth lies rest. For faith does not always mean rushing forward. Sometimes faith means standing still, knowing that God fights for you. Sometimes it means taking the next small step, as David did when he walked to the brook and chose his stones. Sometimes it means lifting a prayer instead of a weapon. As you lay here tonight, listening in stillness, let your own giants fade in size. Let the voice of fear grow quiet, replaced by the whisper of faith. Remember that no shadow is stronger than God's light. No burden is heavier than His hand can carry. No giant stands forever before the Lord of hosts. The story of David is not far from you. It walks beside you in every moment of doubt. It breathes in every prayer you lift at night. It stands with you when the day feels heavy and your heart feels small. And just as God was faithful in the valley of Elah, He is faithful in the valleys you walk now. So rest in this reflection. Let the courage of David become your courage. Let the faith of a shepherd boy remind you that you are never alone. For the God who gave victory then still gives peace now. And in His strength you may sleep without fear. The story of David and Goliath draws to a quiet close. The valley of Elah rests again in silence, the brook still whispering over its stones, the dust long settled where a giant once fell. What remains is not the sound of battle, nor the echo of pride, but the steady truth of God's faithfulness. A truth that does not fade with time, but lingers in every heart that listens. As you rest now, let the story settle over you like a blanket. Let the image of the shepherd boy, standing calm and unafraid, remind you that faith is stronger than fear. Let the memory of smooth stones gathered from a brook remind you that God uses simple things to bring down mighty burdens. Let the sound of David's words echo softly in your spirit, "The battle is the Lord's." Breathe slowly. Let each breath carry away the weight of this day. With every exhale, release the voices of worry, the whispers of doubt, the heaviness of care. With every inhale, welcome peace, courage, and trust. You are not alone in your valley. God is near as He was to David. The giants in your own life may seem tall, but tonight, they stand powerless before the presence of the Lord who watches over you. His strength surrounds you, His love holds you, His peace covers you like gentle night air. You need not strive, you need not fear. Rest in His care. The stars above, the quiet earth below, the steady rhythm of your heart. all testify that you are safe. The same God who calmed David's spirit in the hills, who guided the stone in the valley, now watches tenderly over you. His hand is strong, his arm is mighty, yet his touch is gentle. So close your eyes. Let sleep come like a soft river, carrying you into rest. Let dreams unfold quietly, guided by peace. And as you drift, remember that courage is not only for battle. Courage is also for resting, for trusting, for laying down the sword of your thoughts and letting God fight for you. May your night be calm. May your heart be still. May your spirit rest in the assurance that the battle belongs to the Lord. And when morning comes, may you rise renewed, carrying the quiet courage of David into the day ahead.